Every couple of months, like clockwork, the eerie announcement of a drill would ring over my school's intercom. The lights would be turned off, and we'd be instructed to find a corner of the classroom, hidden from a potential intruder's eyeline. Silence was a must. I went to high school in Texas, and every day from ages 14 to 18, I would walk through metal detectors mandated by the Texas state government to help prevent against gun violence. I carried a bulletproof shield in my backpack as an insert so that if a school shooting were to occur, I would be prepared. I witnessed how this pervasive fear affected learning and created an environment where students and teachers alike didn't feel safe. Because of this, for the past 4 years, I have studied gun violence prevention, and I hope to find a solution rooted in people, not politics. Specifically, I want to use psychology to help understand the person behind the gun rather than the gun itself. So, I studied psychopathy, childhood trauma, and intellectual humility. Now, I can see by your faces that you might not know what I'm talking about, but that's okay. Neither did I when I first started. So let me walk you through it. Let's begin with psychopathy. Psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy or callousness or ruthlessness. But what's interesting is psychopaths can actually be very highly functioning, and they can lead highly successful, stable lives. But other times, psychopaths deviate and are drawn towards violence. I don't know what this says about me, but I find this topic very interesting. The next trait is childhood trauma, which is commonly known as having had negative experiences early on in life. And the reason why I looked at psychopathy and trauma is because these traits are key predisposing risk factors for gun violence. Or in other words, having trauma and/or psychopathy can increase one's likelihood to go towards violence. But the problem is there isn't a lot of information on the relationship between trauma and psychopathy in the context of gun violence. So my first step was clear: to explore the relationship between the two. Now, theoretically, having trauma and psychopathy in an individual could increase their reactivity, or an overlap between trauma and psychopathy could create a highly reactive population that I call traumatized psychopaths. When I took a step back and actually looked at the data, it turns out that this overlap does exist. There is a population of traumatized psychopaths. So now the question was no longer how these traits relate or whether someone could have both, but rather how to reach them. And that's where intellectual humility comes in. While the term might sound intimidating, it's actually a very popular concept in the world of psychology. And it basically means being able to accept that your opinions or beliefs might be incorrect, and being willing to change them when new evidence comes in. In other words, it means not being overly attached to being right, but rather being open-minded and curious enough to recognize that you could have blind spots. It means being confident in your beliefs, but being willing to admit that you could be wrong, which I think we could use a little more of nowadays. Now, intellectual humility is important because it helps us understand how people process information, how they handle disagreement, and react to challenges in their worldview. In a world where people are rewarded for being certain or decisive or unwilling to change their mind, intellectual humility offers the opposite: openness, reflection, and growth. Now, the reason why I focused on an idea as niche as intellectual humility is because those with psychopathy struggle to connect emotionally. So I wanted to see if I could reach them intellectually. So now we've covered who I'm trying to reach, the traumatized psychopath, why I'm doing so, their high reactivity, and how I plan to do so, through intellectual humility. But I haven't actually talked about what intellectual humility does. So trauma stays constant throughout one's lifetime, but psychopathy can be changed. And theoretically, increasing intellectual humility in a psychopathic individual could lower their psychopathy levels. And when I ran the statistics and went through pages and pages of data, it turns out that this theory is true. Increasing intellectual humility can lower psychopathy levels in traumatized individuals, and therefore lessen a key predisposing risk factor for gun violence. This was groundbreaking for my research because it means that there is a solution not rooted in politics or policy, but in people, which is an advantage because most of the time people move faster than policy anyways. But the icing on the cake is that intellectual humility can be taught. Research shows that pursuing learning because of a passion for knowledge rather than external benefits can grow intellectual humility. So when your mom or your teachers told you to pursue knowledge rather than grades, they were right. Pursuing learning for a love of knowledge will increase intellectual humility and therefore lessen key predisposing risk factors for gun violence and violence altogether. So I encourage you to incorporate intellectual humility into your daily lives. Be curious and open-minded not only about yourself, but about others and their beliefs and worldview. Because changing how we approach and perceive knowledge can literally save lives. Thank you.